Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of our Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Tiffany. I'm joined in the studio today with my friend Ty, who is going to be taking us on our tide pool adventure. Now, while we are on our adventure, you might have some questions. You might have some answers to some of my questions. If so, I would love to hear from you. If you are watching this live on Tuesday, let's see, March 18th at 9 to 9:30 a.m., you can text us live. 562-286-1838 is that number. Make sure you get an adult to help send out that text message. Or if you are watching the recording of this, we would still love to hear from you, but instead of texting us, please email us at live@lbaop.org. And teachers, if you are watching this in your classroom, if you could please text us the number of students that are watching with us. That just helps us to better understand how we are serving our community. All right, let's take a look at what is happening behind me. Have you ever seen a place like this? What sort of habitat is this? Now, I just used a fancy science word, habitat. Do you know what that word means? Have you heard that word before? You can give me a thumbs up if you know what habitat means. Thumb in the middle if, maybe I heard of it before, but maybe I forgot. Or a thumbs down if you're like, habitat? I've never heard that word before. A habitat is a home for an animal. So wherever that animal calls home. Some animals live in forests. Some animals live in grasslands. Some animals live in the ocean, but guess what? There's even different types of habitats within the ocean. Just like we have different habitats on land, there are different habitats in the ocean. We have this habitat here, which is a tide pool. We also have kelp forests, we have open ocean, we have coral reefs, all different types of places within the ocean, and we're going to see different types of animals in each of those habitats. So this one here is a picture, well, rather a video, of a tide pool. I know it might not seem like it's a video because you're like, I don't think any of these things are moving, but I can actually see the water rippling right here, and I can see this anemone kind of moving a little bit with that movement of the water. But this tide pool, where do you think we could find this tide pool? Do you think it's in the deep ocean where it's really, really dark? No, it's actually going to be pretty close to the surface and really close to shore. That's why it's one of my favorite ocean habitats, because guess what? You can visit a tide pool without actually getting wet, without going into the ocean, without putting on some scuba gear and exploring for yourself. A tide pool is a very easy ocean habitat for us to access by the land because it is right next to our shore. So let me see, show of hands. How many of us have gone to the beach before? Okay, keep your hand up. If you were at the beach and you saw really big rocks, like this. Keep your hand up if you then were walking around on the really big rocks. Keep your hand up if you were on the really big rocks and you saw little pools of water. Okay, if you still have your hand up, you have visited a tide pool. This is a great video of a drone going over a tide pool. We have here in Southern California, because I'm in Long Beach, California right now. But along Southern California, along our coast, we have this rocky coastline, and it is the perfect place for these ocean waves to come crashing onto the rocks and create little pools. Here in Southern California, this ocean doesn't always stay right there. The ocean is constantly on the move, and we have something called high tide, where the ocean water comes up really, really high, and we have low tide, where the ocean water goes far, far out. And we have high tide and low tide 2 times per day here in Southern California, which means there are times that the water comes all the way up onto the rock, and there's a time of day where the water goes all the way back and exposes all the rocks, but it leaves behind these little pools. Now, sometimes these rocks, when they're all exposed, it looks like the moon to me sometimes. It looks like, wow, nothing could live here, right? Especially ocean animals. The ocean animals need to be out here in the ocean swimming around, right? No. Even though the tide pool can be a really harsh environment, there are lots of different creatures that can call a tide pool home. And that is why I love going to the beach when it is low tide, so that I can walk around on the rocks and I can see lots of cool animals. Like our first animal that actually kind of looks more like a plant, the anemone. Let's see if we can see a picture of an anemone. Look at that. Oh my gosh. Why is this such an adorable picture of an anemone? So this right here, it honestly looks like it'd be some sort of a squishy toy, right? It looks like this would be made out of like a squishy rubber type material, and you would squeeze it like a stress ball. But this is an animal. This and this and this and this. Even this pink one right here. These are all, ooh, I almost missed this one in the corner here. All of these are anemones, and they are all animals. Now, this might not look like an animal you are very familiar with because, well, I don't see any eyes. It definitely doesn't have any fur. This animal here is an invertebrate. A lot of the animals that we find in the tide pool are an invertebrate. Okay, what does that mean? Go ahead and raise your hand up and give yourself a pat on the back. Now, do you feel those bumps on your back? You are feeling your spine or your backbone. Each one of those bumps is a vertebrae because we are vertebrates. You ever seen a cat or a dog? Maybe you have one. Those are vertebrates as well. That means that they have bones. Feel your arm right here. Do you feel that hard stuff on the inside of your arm and on your fingers? You have bones inside of your body. Invertebrates, on the other hand, have no bones. Look at this thing. I said that it looks like a squishy stress ball. Guess what? It is also very, very squishy. We wouldn't want to squish it because, again, it's an animal and we want to be nice to it. But it has no bones. A lot of these animals that we're going to be exploring today don't have any bones. Something that I find pretty cool about these anemones, if you were to touch them, say here at the aquarium, definitely don't touch them out in the wild. They're probably protected. But if you touch them with a gentle 2-finger touch here at the aquarium, and you touch along these tentacles here, it feels really, really sticky. And what is actually happening is this anemone is stinging you. Just like you might know that like a sea jelly or a jellyfish can sting, these anemone are related and can also sting. Why would you want to touch something that stings you? It doesn't actually hurt us. Our skin is too thick. If you were a tiny little fish or a tiny little shrimp, okay, you'd get stuck, you would get stung. But just by touching this anemone, you might feel that it is sticky. This one in particular, you might touch it and you might feel nothing. A majority of this animal is just ocean water. It absorbs a bunch of water, and that's what makes it so squishy. And they can hold on to that water because remember, when we were looking at the tide pool, the tide comes in, but the tide also goes out. So these animals have to go hours and hours every day, either in their small little pool that's left over once the tide goes away, or they have to just live kind of out of the water for hours and hours at a time. So they hold on to water inside of their bodies, and you might actually see them closed up when you visit them in the wild. When you visit them in a real tide pool, they're probably all closed up, and don't have their tentacles out, and you might even see them covered in little pieces of sand, rock, and shells. That's almost like their sunscreen. Just like if you visit the beach on a hot sunny day and you want to protect your skin with some sunscreen, they sort of protect themselves as well by holding on with their stinging, sticky abilities, holding on to little pieces of shell and rock to protect themselves from the sun. Now, right in here, in the middle of the anemone, is where its mouth is. Because remember, I said that it's an animal. Even though it looks a lot like a plant, this thing cannot do photosynthesis for its energy. It does have to eat. And it uses these stinging tentacles to catch its food. And after something is stuck in its tentacles, it'll close up and bring those in towards the center where its mouth is to be able to eat. Now, this anemone isn't eating very big things. Like I said, we can touch it and we don't get stung at all, but it might eat little fish or little shrimp or other little crustaceans. Now, ooh, that's a great picture of the mouth. So we can see this anemone here. There are all sorts of different types of anemones, by the way. We have seen ones that are green. We saw that one just now that was kind of like an orange color and white. We saw a pink one earlier, and now this one looks like it is green, but it has sort of stripe-looking features on it. So again, all around here are those stinging tentacles, and right in there is the mouth. Now, if you are familiar with Finding Nemo, you might know that Nemo lives in an anemone. There are some fish, anemone fish, that can live in an anemone and not get stung. They have a special coating on their body so that they do not get stung. They can live in the anemone so that they are protected, because anything else that tries to get that fish, guess what? It is protected by these stinging cells that the anemone has. Now, in some of the pictures that we have seen of these anemones, we have also seen the next animal that we are going to talk about. It is another invertebrate, which means it has no bones. But if you've ever touched this animal, it might seem weird that it doesn't have bones because it feels really hard and really rough. And I am talking about a sea star. Yes. So these right here are a type of sea star called bat stars. Take a look at all of these beautiful, beautiful colors. Now, the tide pool that we saw, you might see, honestly, a lot of brown or gray because that's the color of the rocks. Those rocks might then be covered in algae, which is green. And those anemones, for the most part, we saw them being kind of green colors for the most part. And as you are walking around in the tide pools, sometimes you don't even notice the anemones, especially when they're all closed up and they're that really dark green color. You're walking around and they just kind of blend in with everything else. Do you think these animals are going to blend in? No. These bat stars are definitely going to stand out with their bright colors. We can see some pink. We could see some orange. This one right here, it might look white on your screen, but it's a very, very light pink. I've seen some that are purple. I've seen some that are blue. You can see that really dark orange one back here. So there are really, really bright colored bat stars, but this is another animal that you can find in the tide pool. When you give a gentle two-finger touch to these animals, they feel a lot like a rock. Now, do you want to bite into a rock, something hard? No. Even when you have hard candy, do you bite it? No, you could break your teeth, right? So there aren't a whole lot of animals that actually eat sea stars. There might be some lobsters that eat sea stars, maybe some birds like seagulls eat sea stars. If you are farther north, like in central California, there are sea otters that might eat some sea stars, but there's not a whole lot of animals that are going to be eating these sea stars. But lately, when I go around tide actually don't see a lot of sea stars. So if the sea stars don't have a lot of predators, why don't we see a lot of sea stars in the tide pools? Can you think of a reason why there's not a lot of sea stars in the ocean right now? There's something called sea star wasting disease. That is a sickness, basically, that wiped out a lot of our sea star population here in California. It actually happened all the way down our coast. So Oregon and Washington were also impacted by this sea star wasting disease. And so when we go tide pooling now, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of sea stars. I've started to notice some sea stars starting to come back into areas where I like to go tide pooling, but there's still not a whole lot. Thankfully, here at the aquarium, we aren't too worried with our populations. We have a lot of bat stars, we have a lot of ochre sea stars, but the wild populations definitely took a huge, huge hit with this sickness, with the sea star wasting disease. There's not a whole lot of sea stars here in Southern California. Now, I just heard that we have a ton of questions. I would love to hear your questions about the tide pool, ocean, invertebrates. Let's see what we got. Ooh, Parker has asked, how many animals in the sea do not have bones? Woo! There are a lot of different types of animals that are not going to have bones. Now, we just saw a fish swimming by. That fish has bones. Sharks are going to have bones. Seals and sea lions, otters, all of our mammals are going to have bones. Our sea turtles are going to have bones. And then almost everything else does not have bones. The anemones, the sea stars, the jellies, crabs, those are all animals that are invertebrates. So animals that are invertebrates are either going to be squishy or they have something called an exoskeleton. Now, I know with a word like exoskeleton, you're like, oh, it has a skeleton, so it has bones. But that word is kind of confusing. I have with me a lobster, and this lobster is an animal that we actually can find in the tide pools. I like to tide pool down in Laguna over by Woods Cove, and it is known for having lobsters. Lobsters, if you were to touch one, feel hard and they feel spiky. And inside of that hard, spiky exterior, they're just squishy meat. So they have almost like a shell-like structure on the outside of their body to help protect them against predators. But it's not considered bones. It's more like a shell than it is like bones, even though it is called exoskeleton. So animals that are invertebrates have no bones are either going to be squishy or they might have an exoskeleton to protect themselves. Or like a snail, if you've ever gone to the beach and found a really cool shell, like this shell that I'm holding now, this is a snail shell. The animal is going to live inside here. That animal is just really soft and squishy and uses this shell, this hard shell, for protection, and it's its home because, again, it has no bones. Okay, we have more questions. Rapid fire. Let's hear it. Okay, so Sakura asks, how many different types of sea stars are there? There is around 2,000, but guess what? So I said these sea stars are definitely not in the deep sea. They're close to the surface, but scientists are still exploring the deep sea, and they can find different types of animals like brittle stars, and there's other types of sea stars down there in the deep sea that maybe we still haven't even discovered yet. But somewhere around 2,000 different species of sea stars. We see a couple of sea stars here in the background. Ooh, that one's a leather star. That one is one of my favorites. We have a handful of different sea stars here at the aquarium, though. All right, next one. Ooh, okay, so Clara and Cameron are asking about the anemones. Why are they so squishy and why do they sting? So, the reason that they sting is because they have something that all animals really have called adaptation. Now, adaptation, you might have heard this word before. It really just means that animals have cool body features that help them to survive. To survive, they need to eat food and they need to avoid becoming food. Being able to sting actually helps these animals with both of those problems. By stinging, they are able to catch food, but by stinging, they are also able to avoid becoming food. Now, why are they so squishy? I said before, they are mostly water. And I have actually seen some anemone before kind of squeeze out most of the water inside of their bodies, and they become flat as a pancake. I know this is a really, really big anemone, probably around this big, but guess what? If it released all of its water, it could be as flat as a pancake. So they are really squishy because they have no bones and they're mostly water. Ooh, so Riley is asking, are the sea stars always warm colors or could they be other colors? So those bat stars that we saw are always those really bright colors. I don't think I've ever seen a bat star that was brown, but remember there are over 2,000 different species of sea stars, and as we can see some of these sea stars in the background, that one kind of does look a little bit more brown. We see one that's orange over here. That leather star, it's kind of light in color, but different species of sea stars are going to be different colors and even different textures. Sadie, it sounds like you also had that same question about sea stars. Glad we could answer your question. Oh, and Sakura wants to know, what is my favorite part of the aquarium? I actually have to say, when you are walking into the Northern Pacific Gallery, on the left-hand side, there is an exhibit that we call the Surge Channel, and it actually has waves that are crashing up against the rocks. And actually, it's a habitat that is close to a tide pool. Ooh, we actually have a video here. So there are waves, and you get to see all of the animals just kind of bobbing around with the motion of the ocean. And sometimes fog is coming down if it's a cold, foggy morning. And I love that exhibit because it reminds me of Monterey. And I used to go up there and visit every summer when I was a kid. And so I love seeing this exhibit because it just feels a little bit more wild to me. Great questions. Ooh, Ethan wants to know other common animals in the tide pools. So we already talked about our sea stars and we talked about our anemones. You will see tons of tiny little shells in the tide pools. Now the shells can be one of two different types of animals. This is an option of what it could be. Do you have any idea what this is? It's a little snail. So, like I was showing you this shell earlier, if you see a shell, it could be a snail, or it could be a hermit crab. So, a snail grows the shell, and as the snail grows, the shell grows with it. As you can see, this is a really big shell. So this was a really big snail. The hermit crab, on the other hand, is just a little crab that has to find an empty snail shell to then call its home. So as the little hermit crab grows up, it constantly needs to change and find new shells. Just like as you get older, you need, look at this adorable little hermit crab. Actually, it's probably a pretty big hermit crab. Just like when you get older, you need to buy new clothes because your clothes don't grow with you, do they? So the hermit crab, as it grows up, needs to find new shells. But the snail, on the other hand, the shell grows with the snail because the shell is part of the snail. For this hermit crab, it's just trying to find snail shells that now no longer have a snail inside of them. So those are very, very common animals that you can find in the tide pools. Whenever I am looking at a tide pool, I like to stay very, very still so I don't scare the animals. And you will constantly see little crabs running around. Now, one of the animals that is a little bit rare to see, but I have seen one in a tide pool down in Laguna, is an octopus. Here in Southern California, we have two-spot octopus, and they get their name because they have a spot. There's that spot. They have this same spot on either side. That's how they get their name, two-spot. They're a very small species of octopus, but we can find them in the tide pools. The one that I saw in a tide pool was trying to hide because so many people were looking at it, but then it started to have its arms go out from underneath the rock, and it was moving its arms like this, almost like pretending to be a snake. So we could see different types of crabs, hermit crabs, snails. You might be able to see an octopus. I already mentioned lobster as well. There's all sorts of tiny little animals, little fish that call the tide pools home. Ooh, and Ethan wanted to know, what is the least common animal that we see in the tide pools? I would have to say maybe somewhere in between the lobster and the octopus. On a lucky tide pooling day, you get to see one of these animals. So, and Parker was also wondering the same thing, the least common animal to see in our tide pools. Now, I also will say I have gone tide pooling and seen a really, really big animal. Can I show you the really big animal I've seen in a tide pool before? A harbor seal! I have gone tide pooling, and there have been harbor seals that come up onto the rocks to sunbathe and to just get out of the water. But I wouldn't say that they're necessarily a typical tide pool animal. Definitely not. All right, Owen wants to know, how does the shell grow on a snail? Kind of like as you eat food, get nutrients into your body, and you grow, right? Your bones inside of your body grow along with your skin and your muscle. It's kind of the same thing with our snails. As they continue to eat food and grow bigger, the shell is just another part of their body. Just like your muscles don't grow without your bones growing, right? So this snail is just another part of their body, just like their mantle is going to grow, their mouth is going to get bigger. Every part of them is growing along with them. Just like with us, right? It'd be kind of weird if we just still had baby arms, right? Or a little baby head, but the rest of us kept growing. The same thing with our snail. All of their body parts are going to continue to grow. All right, I think we might have time for one last question. Riley's question is, do you like researching sea animals? Absolutely. Guess what? When I started working here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, I didn't go to school to be a marine biologist. I actually studied rocks when I went to college. And so when I came to the aquarium, I had to learn a lot about animals. And I still continue to learn about animals because guess what? Scientists still continue to learn about animals. Remember, I was talking about exploring the deep sea, and there's so many animals that scientists still haven't discovered yet. Maybe you can grow up and discover some of those animals. But there is always so much to learn. You can know so much about the ocean, and there is still so much more to learn. So yes, I do love researching and learning more and more about these ocean animals because I love to constantly learn, and then I love to share that knowledge with others. All right, explorers, thank you so much for joining me today. I've had so much fun, but unfortunately, this is just a 30-minute program. So it is time to wrap it up and say goodbye. If you do have further questions, we would still love to hear from you. Please email us at live@lbaop.org. And again, teachers, if you're watching this with your class, please text us with your class numbers just so that we have a better understanding of how we are serving our community. Now, we do have a 10 o'clock class as well. That is going to be with Ty, learning about food webs. We hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your day and keep exploring.